Thank you. So good evening and welcome to the first Compassion in Politics webinar. The webinar is the first one of a series looking at some of the big issues facing us today and what our collective response as progressives and people who believe in compassionate politics should be. Our aim will be to bring together experts and those already working in the field in order to address and help with feelings of overwhelm or paralysis that so often stifle our response, and to be proactive and solution focused, thinking of next steps that we can each take. So I'm really pleased to start off this webinar series with a fantastic panel. We have Paul from Stand Up to Racism, Ben, a political consultant based in Berlin, Lena, the campaign manager from the think tank Compass, and Shyster from the Three Hijabis. So a fantastic range of people. Very grateful to you for giving up your evening, so thank you. My role as chair is to be the non-expert on these issues, so hopefully representing many of us who are really keen to act, but don't always know where to begin. So thinking about some of the recent events, specifically over the summer, the murders in Southport that we saw were seized upon by extremists who really exploited the tragedy to promote their own hatreds and agendas. The online lies and misinformation that inflame the situation, and some key instigators use social media and messaging apps to spread hatred and call for protests at fixed time and places. But the truth is that no one organisation owned or organised the riots. They were much bigger than that. And indeed, that lack of cohesion often makes the situation more unpredictable and dangerous for the authorities. There are so many potential rioters and potential targets, and a lack of obvious national organisations to disrupt. So instead of one core group, it is useful as we begin tonight's discussion to think of right-wing extremism as a spectrum of extreme right, with groups such as Patriotic Alternative to the far right, whose rhetoric we see evading into mainstream political parties. So perhaps then the conclusion to be drawn from the outbreak of violence this summer is that far-right narratives are sadly now much more commonplace than many would like to think of, and that we must now start to collectively respond and upskill the counter-narrative. And that's very much what we hope from tonight, is that it's the start of the discussion and the start of Compassion in Politics really starting to engage with the counter-narrative and what our response can be. So turning to our panel, each will be given up to 5 minutes to talk about their perspectives and their unique viewpoints, some of the work that they've been doing in this area, and crucially, some of the next steps that we can all start to take from now on in. And we're going to start off with Paul, then go to Lena, then Ben, then Shyster, and each have up to 5 minutes to speak about some of the work that they've been doing in this area. So we will hand over, first of all, to Paul to talk about the work you've been doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. And Stand Up to Racism, the mission is very simple. It is to do what the name says, but equally to stand up against fascism. And this is something I didn't know immediately when I joined, but I was very glad to find out, and entirely fits with my own agendas. We are perhaps one of the strongest presences or entities for standing against fascism in the country, as you have seen since the Southport riots, the turnouts in cities all across the country. To encapsulate the sort of approach or the vision towards the issue of the far right surge that is going on, I suggest the following way of looking at it. The story of the rise of the far right now in the present appears to have emanated from the United States and from one individual called Robert Mercer, who perhaps nobody's heard of, or, well, not many people, which is interesting because he is the billionaire who rescued Donald Trump's campaign when it was about to crash out, because he was a joke candidate at the time, and this chap decided to put him together with Steve Bannon and Kellyanne Conway. And I won't go on about the United States anymore. But that is kind of where things started, with a propagandist and a populist Bannon and so on in the States. So that's the beginning of our story in this frame that I'm proposing. And the end of the story, or the present of this story in this same perspective that I'm proposing, is a person called, quote, Steve, unquote, who is one of the far-right activists, one of the hardcore people that I met in Aldershot, and with whom I have carried out direct personal dialogues, not in the view of some kind of friendship particularly. As you can imagine, this is in the scene of a counter demonstration against the far right, but with a perspective to firstly creating a possible future bridge for negotiations with some people in the far right in order to peel them away from diminished numbers, but also to understanding what's actually happening to these people, because some of them are in fact what you might call psychologically vulnerable, even though they look enormous and terrifying, and they are, what's more, violent and big and terrifying. But they can also be, at the same time, people who have been fed on a saturated diet of very high quality propaganda, the best that, in fact, the human race has ever produced. Makes Goebbels look like a beginner. And they are bathed in this, and they are bathed in stress and trouble. Some of the deprived areas where the Southport riots actually took place over the last few weeks, they tend to map onto deprived areas. So it is interesting to know what these people, what is going on with them. Not to excuse any behaviors, because our line is very, very clear. We are there to stop it. There's no question or ambiguity whatsoever. But understanding it helps to stop it. And this is why I've initiated this dialogue with this person who goes by the name of Steve, which is going well so far, surprisingly well. And that is the frame that I propose. And I'm going to just leave it there for the moment and pass on to the next person. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That's such a helpful insight, and I think certainly fits with the core values of compassion in politics. Really helpful to hear it framed in terms of what you're doing on the ground with that. So thank you. We're going to hand over to Lena to talk about the amazing work that Compass do and why you've chosen to focus in on that.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me along. I wanted to pick up on, as you said, Anya, we're talking a few months after the race riots in the UK, and the response at the time was, I think, a lot of one of shock, and then the government response was just be tough on crime and kind of policing and pushing down that response. And I think I'll pick up the shock first. Obviously what was happening was shocking. People setting buildings alight while they had people in them, shocking. But the fact that we got there, given the conditions that we're in, isn't necessarily surprising. And I think people in the progressive space should reckon with the fact that when you have the racism and then the nativism of the far right that pulls the right, and then the center, and then the center, further and further right with it, this lays the ground for the kind of riots that we saw. And when we don't have a hopeful narrative around diversity and difference and our obligations as a rich nation to poorer nations, or when for years and years and years our government repeats their determination to control migration in pretty inhumane language, and the only real opposition language was kind of they're not being tough enough or efficient enough in dealing with the problem, and then add in years or decades of industrial decline and hollowing out of real social security nets, when hunger seems to be a common experience, and we're shaken as a kind of country first by austerity and then Brexit and then COVID, and no one really seems to be having a plan to make things better or to turn things around. And when people's faith and trust in our formal political systems is so low, we've just had a general election with the second lowest turnout since universal suffrage. only 60% of registered voters actually vote and then voted in 2024. And then there's another 8 million unregistered voters. So you've got almost as many people taking part as you have people not taking part at this point. You know, those kind of three factors come together and make the rise of the far right and the recruitment possible. So the economic pessimism, background of anti-immigrant feeling, one that's hostile to multiculturalism, particularly towards migrants, particularly towards the Muslim community, and then this third strand of democratic dysfunction, where your normal political systems are just completely either distrusted or shot through. That's kind of where we're at. And the government response to crack down on criminals, I don't think really speaks to any of those three background factors. And I'm mainly going to speak about that last one because that's the bulk of what Compass focuses on, is that democratic dysfunction and how we use democratic reform to address and tackle the far right. Is it like a tool? But I will say I'm pretty skeptical of any response, particularly a national response, that only speaks about one of those three factors. We need to tackle the harmful and divisive rhetoric about marginalized community, which Stand Up to Racism and also Three Hijabis are doing brilliantly, and we need to address the economic insecurity. But we also need to have this kind of third strand of keeping democracy firmly in mind and fighting for it. And so I think there's a couple of ways that we do that. Pretty specific suggestions, hopefully. Tonally, we're still very much at the point where politics feels like it's being done to people, whether that's the relationship between national government and the citizen, national government and regional government, whether that's just your vote doesn't count or doesn't seem to change anything. And that feeling, addressing that, is really where our efforts should go. So a couple of suggestions and things that we've been developing policy on and seeing how we can push is institutionalizing deliberative democracy at regional levels. So things like citizens' assemblies, participative practices for budgeting. They're good for people's connectedness to politics, for people's agency and ownership about the place that they live. But also just helps build community and bridges divides through the fact that you're spending time with people and doing work with people from the same place that you wouldn't normally meet. I think we also need to take a serious look at how welcoming voting is at the point at which most people engage. So things like automatic voter registration could help with that if the first thing you're faced with is not a pile of paperwork, and scrapping voter ID so that you don't have to justify who you are just to get in. And so that the whole experience and most people's interaction with politics gives them the sense that they do want to be heard from and they are respected rather than kind of pushed out. Improving funding for local government is a really key piece of democratic reforms to help fight the far right, because I think part of Hope Not Hate's great report that just came out has a lot of work on this. People feel a much keener connection with their local community than their national. And so local government are the drivers of a lot of work that can build community and connectedness and resilience for these kinds of things. And really the first step to address some of that anti-politics sentiment even. And then the last thing I'll talk about in terms of specific recommendations is changing the voting system. I think first past the post, the voting system that we have skews the debate so far to the right on immigration in particular, that it's a really key part of the structure of the political structure that's made immigration and like stop the votes narrative such an effective electioneering campaigning tactic for the right. When polled, Brits are about 50-50 split on whether immigration helps the country or hurts the country, but 75% of constituencies in the UK have an anti-immigration majority. So if that's the building blocks of parliament and that's how you win power, that's going to skew your debate to the right. And I think I know there's a lot of significant worry about the increase in reform, particularly as representation and power under PR, and I'm really happy to take questions about that. I don't want to turn this into a PR roadshow though, but I just wanted to flag that there's a significant body of evidence that first past the post also really enables the right and helps them push their agenda. So I'll just finish up here that, we're definitely in a hard place with a hard summer behind us, but this trajectory is not a track in one direction. We can change things. At the end of the summer, we published a report after the riots, and we've been convening civil society with groups like Compassion Politics and the Three Hijabis to think about cross-sector responses and how we support the work that's already happening. And I'm currently working out with Hope Not Hate to see if there's a way that we can't bring that group of organisations behind their call in their recent report for a community resilience czar and support some of the work that they do as well. So yeah, I think that's maybe a hopeful note to leave it on.
Yeah,
Look forward to the questions.
As someone that has often felt that rabbit in the headlights with some of these topics, I'm so grateful for the hopeful note, because actually, although a lot of these issues they're long-term projects, they're cultural shifts, and collaborative work, there is hope there, and that's really encouraging, actually. And you can't move forward unless you think there is some hope. So I'm not going to do Pollyanna thinking, but it's great to hear some of the ways forward. So thank you so much, and thank you as always for what Compass is doing. It's always so encouraging. Ben, over to you. It'd be great to hear from an international perspective about some of these issues.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I think Paul is right. I don't want to excuse the behavior of some individuals either, but fascism or the fascist temptation is part of the human experience. It's always there, lurking in the dark, waiting for the next crisis where people feel insecure, where the epistemic foundations of liberal democracies are under threat because people have certain needs. They want to feel that they belong to something. They have psychological and cognitive needs. And at the moment, there is some kind of crisis burger out there. So back in the days, like 20 years ago, the crisis wasn't very tasty because it looked like an old McDonald's cheeseburger you had forgotten in your pocket and found 10 days after you put it in. And nowadays it's this fantastic, tasty burger out there that everybody wants to eat, basically. And Walter Lippmann wrote in 1922, more than 100 years ago, that as a result of psychological research coupled with the modern means of communication, the practice of democracy has turned a corner. A revolution is taking place infinitely more significant than any shifting of economic power. And for me, that's quite shocking because more than 100 years later, we are back in this situation once again. And this crisis burger has something to do how our way of life is changing, our media landscape, the way we consume information is changing. Our societies are changing. We have become more open, more diverse. And these disruptive changes have always, at some point, benefited authoritarian forces. Just remember what the printing press did to Europe. Then came the radio. Paul mentioned the Goebbels. The United Kingdom found a solution to that, partially Sefton Delmer, who ran a cabaret of propaganda stations in the UK to counter Goebbels' propaganda in Germany. We had television. Pinochet was brilliantly using the TV stations to disrupt every kind of civil society organization that was out there because people were afraid to leave their houses because Pinochet had his torture squads out there. And then Donald Trump used Twitter doing politics via Twitter, and he caused riots just with his words. And this crisis burger is the result of so many different crises. We had like the stock market crash in the early 2000s. We had the terror attacks on 9/11. We had hyperglobalization going on since the end of history, basically becoming a global economy, not just two different blocks. Then we had the global financial crisis, the European sovereign debt crisis, an influx of migrants during the Syrian civil war. We have the climate crisis, the COVID pandemic, war in Europe, and also a digital transformation and the disruption of our infosphere. And all of that has caused a partial breakdown of our epistemic foundations, truth and trust. So people don't know what to believe in. There's this crisis, this misinformation crisis, and we've also lost trust in our compatriots, in our political leaders, in our media, in our institutions, even sometimes in our families, because we don't consume the same news anymore. Every crisis has triggered a psychological response. And I think there's a rise of the far right all over the world, and the mechanisms are more or less the same in every country. There are certain factors in every country, but the mechanism is the same. And Karen Stenner, an Australian-born political psychologist, calls it the authoritarian dynamic. And I think it's a fascinating concept that helps us to explain why the far right is so successful. And I don't want to explain any authoritarian behavior, but we need to explore the psychological basis and its psychological or its societal impact of authoritarianism. Because authoritarianism is not just about dictators and fancy uniforms, but it's a personality trait, similar to probably being an introvert or an extrovert. And around a third of the population in almost all Western societies, it's research mainly done in a Western context. So we can generalize it to other countries as well, but it's really difficult to do that kind of studies in, for example, Africa, or the Middle East, or Southern America. In Southern America, there's some studies to confirm that, actually. But we see that a third of the population has some traits that are heritable, and these individuals have a higher tendency to crave order, conformity, obedience, often feeling kind of unsettled by democracy's messiness and diversity, because liberal democracy is about diversity, freedom, having different opinions. There's not just one leader who tells everybody what to do. And I think that we need to understand that authoritarianism in normal times isn't inherently bad, because some of these people are grandfathers, grandmothers, police officers, sometimes valuable members of their communities. But when this authoritarian dynamic kicks in, they get triggered and they go on this full authoritarian, into this full authoritarian mode, because they have this heightened psychological cognitive need for order and stability. And this is problematic, because examples like Brexit and the Trump election, they actually showed how authoritarian tendencies can be exploited politically, using disgust, anger, and fear. And we saw that during the riots in the UK, where this kind of divisive rhetoric actually fed into all of this. So it's kind of when people feel that the social order is under attack, they no longer act as rational actors. And me being part of the Political Tech Summit, I have some solutions, because we can use political tech tools to tackle some of these challenges. Just a couple of days, and it's kind of interesting that the study was done in the UK. Some researchers from Google and different universities created something like the Habermas machine, an AI tool that adds nuance and sophistication into the debate. And they compared the statements from this Habermas machine with human mediators. And the AI outperformed the human mediators, bringing people from diverse backgrounds together. So one X says this, Y says this, and we add also the perspective of minorities and other viewpoints in. And so AI managed to bring people together. So that's a promising approach. And they tested this on a group of UK citizens from different backgrounds, and it actually worked. So I think that's extremely important. We also have tech tools to combat hate speech. For example, in Slovakia, there was a lot of gender-based violence in online campaigns, and some smart technologists created tools to help combat that instantly. So this also had a lasting impact on the resilience of female candidates. And I think one thing we as humans, or as political animals and beings, need to relearn is remembering how to talk to each other, because we forgot to listen, and to talk to each other because we always use our screens, etc. And democracy in the end needs places to meet. And during the pandemic, during times of crisis, we all became a little bit more isolated. People stopped meeting each other. So I think we need more places where we can actually see each other, because this is what makes us humans. If we only spend our time online, first we shape our algorithms, and thereafter our algorithms shape us. So I think that's very important to keep in mind, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And it's really helpful to bring in that international perspective. And I think it's very easy, even in this discussion, to be quite isolated and be thinking just UK wide. But this is a human condition that we're talking about in so many ways. So thank you for that wider perspective. Really, really useful. Last but absolutely not least, someone I'm very privileged to have worked with previously, and it's just lovely to have you here, Shaista. I'm looking forward to your input and you telling us a little bit about what you've done previously and what you're doing now in this area.
Thanks, Anya, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. So I think the first place where I want to start from is the far right, anti-refugee, migrant, Islamophobic, racist riots that we've seen in this country, in the UK, over the summer, and to say that it did not come as a shock to anyone from minoritized communities that this happened, particularly British Muslim communities are obviously a very diverse range of people, despite what the media might tell you, and refugees and asylum seekers who are struggling to survive an incredibly dehumanizing system in this country, which over a period of time has become worse and worse for them. And so if you put these two things together, and then also in the past year, we've got the horror of the genocide unfolding in Gaza, the bombing of Lebanon, and obviously hostages still being held by Hamas in Gaza as well. So we have an international context as well, and there are other contexts such as Russia, Ukraine, and multiple other contexts as well. But this particular one in the Middle East has seen a 300% rise in recorded Islamophobic hate crime in the UK in the past year, and the vast majority of that hate crime is directed towards Muslim women, according to the body that works with the government, Tel Mama. And we've also seen a massive spike in anti-Semitism as well. And usually where you get Islamophobia, you also get anti-Semitism. Where you have anti-Semitism, you have Islamophobia. And we also know that these are drivers for the far right across the world, especially in Europe. And I think the other thing that I want to really focus on is that often when we have discussions about the far right, there's a lot of focus on so-called shady groups operating somewhere in the shadows of the internet, or organized far right on the streets, which is these two things do happen. Horrifically, in 2024, we have a number of hard right governments, and some of them are far right governments in Italy, in Hungary, in Austria, in Finland, in Slovakia, in the Czech Republic, and here in the UK we have a more hardened right Conservative Party that was very right-wing when it was in government, and it's certainly right-wing now. And we also have the Reform Party as well. So the point here is that the politics of the far right are mainstream. They are not somewhere in the shadows, which you have to kind of go out of your way to go locate them on the internet. They are mainstream. They're part of our daily so-called democratic systems. And, you know, we've got France, where very recently the far right almost got over the line and they were pushed back by the people. And the Netherlands is constantly sort of teetering around with its own democratic system as well. And the two things that really galvanize these kinds of political movements that become mainstream democratic projects is anti-immigration and refugee hatred, and also deep-seated Islamophobia, which has been around for hundreds of years, and it's been denied as a form of racism in lots of parts of the world, including here in the UK. The government is still, I mean, obviously this government is new, but the previous government and the current government still have not decided what they want to do about getting a definition of Islamophobia on the law books, so that there is something to work from. So currently the situation is very grim. And when it comes to the far right riots, again, they did not come as a surprise to people. So as a British Muslim woman who chooses to wear a headscarf, a hijab, I don't live in a part of the country where the racists were on the streets. But that did not stop my family members from being very terrified and scared and anxious and not wanting to leave their homes, particularly the elders who feel more vulnerable because of the fact they look vulnerable. I also have a lot of family in the north of England, and the kind of conversations that we were having, you know, third generation Brits of Muslim heritage in this country, is the kind of conversations that my parents' generation were having when they first were invited to the UK to help rebuild this country and to contribute to it economically. So we're talking about conversations about whether family members should tape up their letterboxes. Will that make it safer for them to not be attacked by petrol bombs and things like that? I also work very closely with refugees and asylum seekers. I work for an organisation that supports people, including those in the hotels that were targeted. And, you know, we are supporting individuals, including Muslim women, refugees, who were being targeted because they wear the hijab, who were being picked on specifically, not only because they were refugees, but because, well, they are refugees because they're Muslim and because they're women and because they choose to identify as a Muslim. And we know that the far right is very misogynistic and homophobic and transphobic and everything else. But we know that one of their calling, kind of the rallying calls, is about you know, trying to ensure more and more legislation is introduced, particularly across Europe, around the banning of Muslim women's clothing choices. So we're talking about headscarves, we're talking about face veils, we're talking about other clothing. And we've seen this across so-called strong democracies such as France, Austria, and other parts of Europe, where this is mainstream policy. And we have to ask ourselves, what is going on in Europe where governments are so fixated with Muslim women's clothing choices, particularly the niqab, the face veil, which is a minority of women within a minority. So for anyone to suggest that, you know, this minority within a minority are, you know, kind of disrupting the fabric of democracy in Europe is absolute nonsense. So I'll just wrap up by saying that the Three Hijabis, we are an organisation that came about on the back of the last Euros that were held in the UK. It was just after lockdown. It was just after the Black Lives Matter movement reinvigorated around the world, and we saw the racist murder of George Floyd at the hands of a white police officer. We all saw that. We all saw what happened as a result of that. And so what was also going on in this country at the time was the England national men's football team were being vilified by the government of the day for choosing to take the knee and for standing up and saying that we are proud anti-racists. So we came along and we defended the football team. And to cut a long story short, we galvanized more than a million people in the space of 48 hours who signed our petition calling on the government, tech companies and football to work together to ban racism from football. And since then, there has been some positive movements there, but increasingly, we are seeing the far right continue to weaponize our cultural spaces, including football, across Europe, to spread their disinformation and also spread fear across communities who, you know, live in close proximity to football grounds. But they weaponize many of our institutions and instruments such as culture for this purpose. So what do we need to do? So there's a couple of things that we want to suggest to you as Three Hijabis. The first one is we have to name what's going on. If we are not going to name what's going on, then we cannot have any hope of finding ways to bring people and communities together. So the fact that I agree with what you said, well, what the entire panel said, but what you said, Lena, about the fact that the government's response to the far right riots so far has been about a criminal justice approach, which is not, it cannot be the only approach. There has to be a criminal justice element, but what about everything else, right? So we have to name what's going on. We have to name Islamophobia for what it is, whether governments, whether, you know, people in power want to call it what it is, that is what it is. It's a major, major driver for far right racism and hatred across the world. We need to, in our workplaces, be courageous and call for anti-racism education programs in our schools, in our higher education institutions, and also in our places of work. And let's not forget that over the last 14 years of Tory rule in this country, all of this has been packaged as being woke and has been part of a culture wars. You know, our England national football team was dragged into the culture wars. Anytime anyone stands up to be counted to defend the rights of minorities, it ends up becoming fodder for the culture wars. So this is a shameful situation that we're in. We also have seen in this election in the UK a record number of independents stand and get elected, and whether people like it or not, that is a democratic process that candidates went through. And the level of racist and sort of delegitimizing kind of rhetoric that came from mainstream politicians, you know, about these people all being divisive, these people not really being democratic, and these people overwhelmingly are brown working class Muslims. So let's not, you know, let's name it for what it is. We've also had a government that has put restrictions on people's right to protest. People's democratic right to protest is being undermined every single day in this country. And it's especially being undermined when people stand up and to be counted against a genocide that's unfolding before our very eyes. So all of these ingredients are extremely dangerous, because what you then have is a democracy itself folding in on itself and not being willing to hold a space and contain space for pluralism and for a wide section of views to be tolerated. Now, I don't like this word tolerated, but I'm using it purposefully here. And so the people in charge need to also understand that if they're going to further demonize the environmental movement, the climate justice movement, the gender justice movement, the anti-racism movement, you know, the movement against what's going on in Gaza and Lebanon and other places as well, then there will be this type of pushback taking place. And I think the final point is here, we have to tell our story. What is our story? We need to be proud of the story of pluralism, and we need to tell a story about modern Europe and the world. And part of the challenge here is that because the history of Europe is not taught to us. I mean, when I grew up here in Oxford, I went to school, a state school, and I remember being taught about the width of the train tracks during the Industrial Revolution, but at no point was I ever taught that actually my ancestors, you know, from the continent from South Asia, it was all their labor that was and what was being taken from you know, my ancestors, that was being brought into this country on the very train system, right? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I'm very hopeful, because what we have is more and more people learning about what's going on and wanting to engage with what's going on and rejecting this really this politics of fear. That's what it is, right? It's also hateful as well. We can't get away from that. But overwhelmingly, it's the politics of fear. And I think when we give people an alternative, when we offer them an alternative story, such as what we did with as the 3 hijabis, the fact that 3 British Muslim women in hijab stood up at a very you know, horrifying juncture of racism in this country, which continues to this day, and all that noise, you know, around being woke and all of that. You know, we brought lots of different people together, and I think people are crying out to be brought together. I think people want to have conversations. They may sometimes not feel that they have the language to have those conversations. So what we need is to be far more compassionate, and we need to create space and hold the space open for people to get things wrong. I get things wrong all the time, to show grace to people and to let people come on the journey. I mean, if we're going to carry on talking to the same people all the time, we are also guilty of being in our bubbles, right? And so I think that is the work that we need to do. And we need to build a movement that is broad and representative of the people on the front line. And I'm sorry to say this, but it's true that a lot of anti-racism movements in this country are all about come out on a protest here, do a day of activity here, and that's it. And there has to be, you know, people of color don't need white saviors. Nobody needs white saviors. White working class people don't need white saviors. What we need to do is create a space where all our humanity is recognized and protected and defended. And we have to tell the story of our communities, you know, at local level, at national level, and at international level, because the politicians aren't going to do it. They're really not. So we need to do it, and they need to listen to us and come on board.
Amazing. I feel like cheering slightly for all of you. That so much good stuff, really, really inspiring, and so much to take from it. I've written a few points down. I just want to summarize, I guess it's the way that I'm thinking about some of the things that you've just said, Shaista, even about, you know, how do we start to form that narrative? How do we, you know, put something forward that's really exciting, going back to what you were saying, Ben, about the burger. How do we have an alternative, whatever the alternative to a burger would be? You know, we need to show
Biryani, Anya, how about that?
perfect. Yeah, I'm not big on burgers, so thank you. Sorry, Ben. But I just scribbled down a few things and then we'll go to the questions. But genuinely, thank you all so much. I think what was really clear, listening to all of you, was some of the problems that you all were reiterating, you know, the economic issues, the anti-migrant rhetoric that's been around for such a long time, and the democratic dysfunction. I thought that was really, really clear from listening to all of you. That's almost, you know, the bedrock of what we're up against. But then some of the counterpoints, you all were really clear about the need to not be shocked. You know, this is not an isolation event that happened over the summer. We must stop being shocked when these things happen. Building a hopeful narrative, the absolute role of dialogue, even when it's difficult. You know, Shaista, you just said that so clearly about, you know, needing to reach out from outside our bubbles. It's really, really important. And the work of Compass, for example, in deliberative democracy. Rebuilding trust in politics, loud and clear, that's absolutely foundational. And Paul, I know much of the work that you're doing is around that. Being really specific with some of the issues, calling it out for what it is, Islamophobia, not just always saying thuggery, but actually racism, you know, calling things what they actually are, and really building that strong counter narrative. Those were all points that I really heard from everything you were saying. So thank you so much. Paul, you've got your hand up already. So before we come to the questions, go for it.
Could I just a brief thing before we get to the questions?
Yes, please.
This problem has so many sides to it, but I am concerned that we don't overlook. We are seeing very clear evidence of foreign influence operations. We have trackers following extremists, schools which are springing up in Portsmouth for sports training, which turn out to be Russian funded. We have Turning Point, which is American funded and pro-Putin, using the largest, perhaps, social media platform on the planet, and campaigning with Donald Trump. I don't want us to miss out where is the money coming from in this discussion.
Yeah, thank you. And you've been really, having worked with you over a few months now, I think that's such a brilliant piece that you always bring into every discussion we have. And you're so right, otherwise we're missing a massive part of the story. I'm going to go on to the questions because we've got some absolutely brilliant ones. And thank you for everyone pointing out that there's, interestingly, going to be quite an interesting programme at 10 o'clock tonight on behind the scenes around Hope Not Hate. And some of the work that they've been doing. So that will be definitely worth watching. Question to Ben, but also to everyone else. What can the UK learn from the success in comments of the right in Germany and Austria? What can we learn?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yes.
May I add something to what Paul said before I answer your question? Paul, you're absolutely right. There are FEME campaigns, foreign influence campaigns going on, but I think it's extremely important to not get distracted what's going on in our communities, because these communities they exploit the rifts and the problems in our community. So they turn up the volume. They mostly don't produce the problems, they just increase or turn up the volume on them, and that's a big problem. Sometimes they also try to shift and bring in their own narratives, but especially in Germany, they exploit problems that are out there for a very long time. It might be different in the UK, especially with Brexit, but in Germany we see that they target groups that have these authoritarian sentiments on the far right, because these people have hierarchical worldviews and they always see the world in black and white. They are also very susceptible to misinformation that confirms their biases. And I think that's really important to mention. What the UK can learn probably from Germany and Austria. So first, this is something Lena said, changes to the political system are probably extremely helpful, but there are path dependencies, and it's really difficult to make changes to very established institutions and norms. And in Germany, we have an ongoing discussion how to introduce additional guardrails for our constitutional court so that the far right can't pack it or make changes to it, because we have this very strong constitutional court. We also have other institutions where we discuss how to prevent them from being overtaken or abolished by the far right, because some funding or some organizations, they could potentially be shut down with just one signature if the far right gets a majority in one of our states. What also helps is just recognizing. So the first step in solving any problem is recognizing there is one. That's a quote from the newsroom, and that's what Scheista said as well. So there's this cultural assault on reality, and we need to call it out for what it is, because these authoritarians or people on the far right, they thrive on like doom and gloom. It's not, they don't share our reality, or some of them know that they are lying, but they lie. Lying is just a strategy for them, and it works especially well with nativist speaking points, or if you target women, foreigners, asylum seekers, because they don't belong to the normative social order that the far right has envisioned. So it's this white old back in the days, like the good old days weren't the good old days, because there were problems in all the times, and it's this hierarchical worldviews. Men are above women. The established order should not change and stuff like that. So I think what's really important is to get in new people into politics. I think UK managed to do that during the last election. So a lot of new Labour MPs got voted in, because if you have changing norms or a new generation is coming in, these people bring in new ideas, then it's probably broad coalition building. That's something we saw in France, for example, where they had the cordon sanitaire, and even the far left managed to cooperate with the centrist or even center right. The Republicans are more Republicans are no longer a center right; they're basically a center right to right party at the moment. So, but even the right, center right, was included in this broad tent approach, this Republican front. So that helped a lot, of course. But in the end, we need to make sure that we find new frames, because Scheista was completely right. We need to promote tolerance and diversity, but at the same time, that can backfire, because it can increase this authoritarian anxiety, and these individuals may feel even more threatened. And the solution isn't to suppress diversity, but to frame these efforts more carefully, fostering probably connections across differences and reducing the us versus them mentality. And in Liverpool, there was this fantastic study run by economists, and they found out that when Mo Salah became like this superhero of Liverpool, so anti-Muslim hate crime actually went down because people in Liverpool felt like a Muslim contributed something to the success of their favorite sports team, and that helped them to see the Liverpool football star and not the foreigner. And I think we need these stories to include people in our daily lives and tell stories of success where people contributed to their local communities, not just from probably culturally diverse backgrounds, but also from people who faced hardship, probably in Northern England, because these people are also not present. That's what Shaista said as well. We need to tell more stories and not just from London or the suburbs. And we need to learn to bring in all these diverse voices once again.
And I wanted to bring up, that's one of the questions that's come up in various guises in the chat around the role of poverty and socioeconomic issues and how that then feeds into this. And I wonder what Shaista, Lena, Paul, what some of the factors are behind this.
Yeah, so of course, poverty and deprivation and people not having hope or believing that their lives are going to be better than their grandparents' generation, which frankly in the UK, most people are in that situation, is important, and we must tackle that. And we must also acknowledge that actually some of the highest rates of child poverty in this country are amongst British Bangladeshis, for example, are amongst British Pakistanis, for example. And despite some of the right-wing racist narrative out there, it's not because they're breeding lots of children, it's because they are at the bottom of the social economic realm, and they have always been at the bottom, and their life chances and life expectancy has not increased, I should say. Social mobility is completely stagnant in this country, and it has been for more than 10 years. Indeed, the Mobility Commission disbanded because they said they couldn't do their work properly. And I also think we have to be careful here, because there is also a narrative which is racist and alienating, which is that it's the white working class who are the only racists in this country. It's only the white working class who are susceptible to far right ideologies. This is not true. This is also a racist trope that needs to be examined. So, in many cases, people of working class backgrounds, particularly white people, are being demonized, and they're also being manipulated, and they're taking to the streets, as we have seen. And some of them were being manipulated, others weren't. Others were doing the manipulating. But I think we have to be a little bit wiser around this narrative as well, because the people who are pulling the strings are people with a lot of money. There's international actors involved, and they are using working class people as fodder. Working class people who have no prospects, who are, living in poverty. So I think we have to also be aware that in our attempts to build a movement, that we're not doing what these people are doing, which is further labeling and minimizing and minoritizing people, and not listening to them and not listening to their pain, and understanding what is going on. And just to be very clear, there is a difference between people who don't have a house, living in overcrowded homes and all those things, and people who can't pay their bills at the end of the month. They're not racist, they're not far right people. And then there's the far right over here, right? So I think we have to make clear distinctions there, because otherwise we get into this dangerous game of us and them. And that's what these people with power and money want. They want us to be fighting each other for the crumbs. And I always say this, that I don't want the crumbs, I want the bakeries, and I want all the bread for everyone, and I want that to be shared with everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Paul, you're nodding away, and I know this feeds into a lot of your thinking as well. And then we'll bring you in.
Excellent point. Thank you, Shaista. Stand Up to Racism actually grew out of the unions, and it's not just working class people, it's a full-on working class culture, which totally makes your point. I just want to, there is so much information around this subject that I think you could get completely lost in it and not know where to go. And so I would like to point to one specific data point, which is the fact that we know when people live in conditions of excessive deprivation and doubt and misinformation, this is the story we all learned at school, those of us who are 50-something. This is how it happened in Germany. It started from extreme deprivation in one of the most, in fact, highly educated populations on Earth. And so you ask, how could this have happened? Well, it happens in such situations of deprivation. So the economics here, just getting the economy to work properly for those communities by itself would take down 60 or 70% of the interest in the far right. We should not forget that as long as the conditions are there for fascism, it's not an excuse, it's not excusing anything, but if the conditions exist for fascism, you get fascism. And as long as those conditions remain, fascism continues to grow regardless who is in government. And I'm connecting that obviously to 1930s Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to bring Lena in here. And there was a specific question to you anyway in the chat about the role of citizens' assemblies and the work that you've been doing on that. Are they likely to be a useful mechanism for reducing polarization and extremism in society? So I think going back to, some of what Paul was just saying, can you talk to us a little bit about that? And then unfortunately, we're going to have to start wrapping up.
Yeah, and I will be brief so that the other panelists can have the last say. There's a couple of things I wanted to pick up from the contributions, and then I'll get to the specific Citizens' Assembly question. I think Scheist is exactly right about pluralism. Where we can't have a conversation, a lot of the hope of tackling this isn't it, that hope isn't going anywhere. And I think that, Paul talking about having this conversation with Steve is part of that. Like, actually, a lot of the sentiments that we're hearing. I saw someone say this in the chat, as a candidate from the general election, people feel shame about not wanting to say the wrong thing or not wanting to have this conversation. So having a space where you can have genuine conversation that isn't hurtful, I feel is really important. And that pluralism point is core to what a lot of Compass does and where it came from. So I just wanted to pick that up. The other thing that we've been kind of circling around is the economic situation and its relationship to reform in particular, I think is really interesting. Reform is, and the voters of reform are not one block of voters. And when we're talking about kind of the class differences and the way that, and I really agree with what Scheist said about the way that this the riots in particular were talked about as if there was these like working class thugs somewhere outside of London. I mean, like, this is an insane way to treat this phenomenon. But there is a divide in reform voters, and if you divide by income, there's a united front against or opposition to immigration and multiculturalism and kind of trust of politicians, and that is there across reform voters when polled. But there are differences between you divide by income of like more libertarian values and more state intervention and kind of what we would often call progressive economic values and more about redistribution of wealth. And so I think when we talk about combating the parliamentary rise of the right, we need to think about the ways that people are getting to the point where they vote reform. A lot of it is a protest vote, a lot of it is that. So just
Thank you.
that.
Yeah, I knew this would happen. There's too much that we can talk about. We're going to have to do a part 2. I would just love it. Lena, we'll start with you. Can you give the listeners, people listening on playback, one thing that they could go away and do after tonight?
I think, oh God, I'm gonna do the easy thing, and I think join the organizations that are on the call. Join Compassion in Politics, the 3 Hijabis, Stand Up to Racism. Compass is a membership organization, and the only reason we can do what we do is because members support us. So I'd say join the organizations and see what's happening in your community that can help start having those conversations about what's going on in place.
Brilliant, thank you. Ben?
Pick up one of the great books written by giants on which shoulders we all stand, like Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny is brilliant. It's 20 lessons very it's just this very small book. And yeah, authoritarianism comes in different shapes. It's right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. So the challenges are different. There are working class voters who can be messaged with different tools and messages, and there are these hardcore people, social dominance oriented people who just have this very hierarchical worldview, which puts them on the right. So I think what is extremely important, we need to defend the facts and help to create a shared, once again, a shared reality. Because there is also the problem, and we didn't discuss that in detail, of partisan media. And that was something that divided Germans in the 30s even more. And I think in the United States is one of the countries where we can see what partisan medias can do. The US economy is growing. It's growing at the fastest level in years, but still Republicans and Democrats disagree if the economy is doing well or not. So Republicans say the economy is in shambles. It isn't. So if we don't live in the same reality, if this cultural assault on our shared reality continues, then it doesn't matter if we deliver on policy, but we need to bring people together and agree on facts. And that's probably my one and only advice to everybody. Try to protect the reality-based community you're in.
Yeah.
Because most people want to agree on what is right, truth, and what is lies.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Shaista.
Yeah, so I think the main one from us is to be ready to be uncomfortable. Be comfortable in your own discomfort when it comes to these issues. Go and learn, go and find out, but also be willing to have uncomfortable conversations with people and hold space open for people to get things wrong. There's a very big difference between getting things wrong and someone being very, very, using violently racist language. These are two different, spectrums here, and often they're blurred. And what we find is that there's more outrage at being called a racist in the UK than there is at actual racism. And what we need to be outraged at is the racism and is the dehumanizing. And so we can only do that if we hold space open and enable people to go on a journey and help them to get on that journey. I think, we can all learn something from each other.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Paul, final word from you. No pressure.
Well, I think the compassion angle is important because of this kind of insight we're trying to get into the human angles of everything. I think being practical rather than theoretical is vital because this is an immediate problem that our country is facing right now. And I would imagine that the Labour government are going to legislate on it very soon after the Tommy Robinson riots, which are coming this Saturday. And other than that, I think, honestly, we could have easily spent 6 hours exploring this question without running out of quality material. And I hope that we will do something more on the subject.
I think we need a part 2. I am so grateful for not just your attendance this evening to all the panelists, but honestly for the work that you're doing in this space. A lot of work to do still, but I'm left feeling hopeful tonight, and I'm very grateful for that personally. Compassion in Politics is a membership organisation, so please get involved. If you can donate, that would be amazing, but please just get involved with the work that we're doing. Come and look at the website, look at all the fantastic websites of the people here represented, and just a huge thank you to everyone for attending tonight, for all your work doing in this space, and thank you just so much for this first webinar. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.